The soft glide of Aaliyah's voice could make a whole room feel like midnight, calm, untouchable, almost floating. But that version of the story leaves something out, because behind the sunglasses, the choreography, the quiet smile, there was a young woman moving through a system that learned how to sell her mystery before it fully protected her humanity. The world remembers the icon, the videos, the futuristic sound. But maybe the deeper tragedy is that Aaliyah was just beginning to become herself when the machinery around her had already taken so much. So, what really happened to Aaliyah? Let's fade to black. To understand Aaliyah, we have to go back to Detroit, January 16, 1979, a city where music was never just entertainment. It was inheritance. It was church, radio, Motown memory, family gatherings, and the sound of people trying to make beauty out of pressure. Aaliyah Dana Houghton was born into a family that recognized her gift early. And that matters, because when a child is talented, the world often calls it destiny before asking what that destiny might cost. She was still young when stages, studios, and cameras started becoming normal. Too normal. The kind of normal that can make a teenager look grown before she has been allowed to be young. What made Aaliyah different was not just the voice. It was the control. She did not attack a song, she slipped inside it. Her presence was quiet, but it was not weak. Even then, there was something almost cinematic about her, like she understood the frame before the frame understood her. But here is where admiration slowly becomes expectation. Because once an industry sees a young girl as marketable, innocence can become a brand, mystery can become a strategy, and talent can become someone else's business plan. Before Aaliyah could fully define herself, other people were already learning how to package her. And that is where the story stops being simple. By the time Aaliyah stepped into the glow years, R&B was changing. The big voices were still there, the church runs still mattered, but a new cool was entering the room. Darker beats, looser clothes, videos that felt like fashion editorials, and a kind of confidence that did not need to shout. Aaliyah fit that shift perfectly. She sounded young and old at the same time, soft but precise, distant but somehow personal. Her early success made her seem effortless. Songs became radio memories. Videos became style references. Her hair over one eye became a language of its own. On MTV and BT, she did not chase the camera. She let the camera come to her. That was the magic. In an era when many artists were being asked to be louder, brighter, more available, Aaliyah made privacy feel expensive. Here is what the camera did not capture. Behind that calm image was a teenager learning an adult business in real time. The same machine that made her look untouchable also demanded constant movement. New songs, cleaner branding, better visuals, more maturity, more mystery. And mystery, when sold by other people, can become a cage. Still, Aaliyah kept evolving. With each new era, the sound became sleeker, stranger, more futuristic. The vocals sat inside the production like smoke under glass. She was not trying to overpower the track, she was teaching the track how to breathe. You could hear the difference in the way she phrased a line, then disappeared before the emotion became too obvious. That restraint became part of her signature, and then came the bigger vision. Film rolls, more polished videos, a sharper sense of self. By the time the world reached the early 2000s, Aaliyah no longer felt like a promising girl being introduced to us. She felt like a woman quietly taking ownership of the room. But success can hide pressure better than failure ever could. The brighter the spotlight, the harder it was to see the negotiations behind it. Who chose the image? Who controlled the schedule? Who benefited from the mystery? Who was allowed to speak? And who was expected to stay graceful? That is the tension of Aaliyah's glow years. They were beautiful, but they were not simple. Every step forward carried the shadow of a system that knew her value before it fully honored her voice. And underneath the smooth choreography and velvet vocals, something was waiting. Not because she lacked power, but because she was still fighting to decide what kind of power would be hers. There was brilliance on the screen, but behind it, something was quietly asking how much a young star should have to surrender to shine. The hand that shaped Aaliyah's story was not only one person. It was a whole arrangement of power. Labels, producers, managers, executives, adults in rooms where a teenage girl's future could be discussed like a product launch. That is why the early part of her career feels so uncomfortable to look at now. Not because her talent was manufactured, it was not. The voice was real, the presence was real, the discipline was real. But the frame around her was built by people who understood the marketplace before she could fully understand the contract. On stage, she looked weightless. Backstage, Choices were being made about what she should wear, how mysterious she should seem, how grown she should appear, and how much of her own story she was allowed to explain. That contrast matters, because control does not always look like someone taking the microphone away. Sometimes it looks like letting you sing while deciding what your silence is worth. And then something changed. Aaliyah began to move differently. The image grew sharper, the music darker, the interviews more self-possessed. She was not escaping the machine all at once. Nobody does. But she was learning how to push against it, quietly, carefully, in a language the industry could not fully own. That is the tragedy inside the glamour. The closer she came to herself, the clearer it became how long the system had been standing between her and true creative freedom. By the time Aaliyah's final album reached the world, something in her image had shifted. She was still cool, still quiet, still impossible to read completely. But there was a new firmness there, a sense that the girl people once packaged as mystery was becoming a woman who understood the power of being unreadable on her own terms. That is the moment I would freeze, not the tragedy, not the headline. That moment before the door closes, when the future still feels wide open. She was stepping into film, stretching the sound of R&B, and carrying herself like someone who had survived being defined by other people, and was finally learning how to define herself. She finally looked like someone arriving in her own life. And that is what makes it hurt. Because the story was not ending in decline. It was not ending after failure, public rejection, or creative exhaustion. It was ending at the exact point where the next chapter seemed ready to begin. Aaliyah was not fading from the culture. She was becoming more visible, more controlled, more hers. And that makes what came next feel unbearable. It also shows how protection often arrives much too late. Everything around her was expanding at once. Music was no longer the only doorway. Film was opening, fashion was listening, and R&B was moving toward a future that sounded like the one she had already been building. That is what makes the turning point so hard to hold. Aaliyah was not trapped in a comeback narrative. She was not trying to prove she still mattered. She had already proved that. The harder question was what would happen when she finally had enough space to decide where the image ended and the woman began. Then, suddenly, the conversation changed from future tense to memory. The world did not get a slow goodbye. There was no final era we could watch unfold, no late interview where she explained what freedom meant to her, no decade of reinvention, mistakes, recovery, and growth. Just a break in the line, and when a life is interrupted that way, culture rushes to make it neat. Icon, angel, legend. But those words can sometimes hide the anger, because she deserved more than mythology. She deserved time, safety, and the ordinary right to become a woman whose future did not have to be protected only in hindsight by everyone. After Aaliyah was gone, the silence did not feel empty. It felt crowded. Crowded with songs that suddenly sounded different, videos that became memorials, and interviews where every smile seemed to carry more weight than it did before. For many fans, grief became mixed with nostalgia. They remembered the clothes, the choreography, the calm voice sliding over beats that still felt futuristic. But underneath that nostalgia was another feeling, harder to name. The sense that something had been taken before anyone understood how much it would mean. Maybe the question was never whether she mattered. Of course she mattered. You can hear her influence in the artists who came after her, in the way R&B learned to value atmosphere, restraint, and coolness as much as vocal fire. You can see it in every singer who understood that softness could be powerful, that silence could become style, that mystery could carry emotion. But influence is not the same as justice. The industry loves legacy because legacy is safe. It can sell the image after the person is no longer here to ask for more. It can celebrate the sound without answering why so many young black women have had to be polished, packaged, and protected too late. That is the open wound in Aaliyah's story. We still speak about what she might have become, because part of us knows she had already begun becoming it. And maybe that is why the memory refuses to settle. It is not only sadness, it is frustration. It is the feeling that admiration arrived loudly, but protection arrived after the door had closed. There is no clean ending here, only a pause that keeps asking us why brilliance must so often be honored as history before it is defended as life while still breathing fully. So when I think about Aaliyah now, I try not to reduce her to the tragedy. That would be too easy, and it would repeat the same mistake the culture often makes, turning a full person into a symbol because symbols are easier to carry than responsibility. Her story is not only about talent. It is about timing, control, and the strange cruelty of an industry that asks young artists to grow up fast, then acts surprised when they needed protection all along. It celebrates maturity, but rarely gives artists the private years required to become mature. It praises mystery, then profits from silence. It calls women icons after spending years deciding how much of themselves they were allowed to own. Aaliyah did not simply leave a gap in music. She left a question the industry still has not answered. What do we owe artists before they become legends? Not after the memorials, not after the tribute performances, not after the documentaries and anniversary posts. Before, while they are still choosing, learning, resisting, and becoming. Because maybe the version of Aaliyah the world never got to meet was not just another album, another movie, or another era. Maybe it was a woman finally living without being translated by everybody else. And that loss should make us angry. So I want to ask you, what version of Aaliyah do you think the world never got to meet before everything changed forever?